The morning sun cast long shadows across the corridors of Windsor Castle. Camilla walked with purpose through the ancient hallways, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors. She had been awake since dawn, her mind racing with thoughts that had kept her restless all night. The Queen's private chambers were just ahead, and she knew this might be her only chance. The palace was quieter than usual, with most of the staff attending to arrangements in London. Her heart pounded as she approached the ornate double doors that led to the late Queen's personal rooms. She had always admired the Queen's jewelry collection. During formal dinners and state occasions, she would watch as the Queen wore pieces that had been in the royal family for generations. The diamonds, the emeralds, the historic tiaras that had graced the heads of queens for centuries. Now that the Queen had passed, Camilla felt a strange sense of entitlement. After all, she was married to the king now. Shouldn't these treasures be hers to wear? She convinced herself that she was simply claiming what was rightfully hers. What would eventually come to her anyway? The door opened quietly. The room still held the faint scent of lavender, the Queen's favorite. Camilla felt a momentary pang of guilt, but pushed it aside. She moved quickly toward the mahogany dresser where she knew the Queen kept some of her most precious pieces. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the top drawer. There they were. Velvet boxes of various sizes, each containing treasures beyond imagination. She reached for a box containing a diamond bracelet that Queen Victoria had once worn. The stones caught the morning light, sending tiny rainbows across the walls. Camilla picked up another box, then another. A sapphire necklace, a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to Queen Mary, a brooch with rubies that glowed like drops of blood. She laid them out on the dresser, her eyes wide with fascination. Each piece told a story of British history, of royal weddings and coronations, of triumphs and tragedies. She opened her handbag and began carefully placing the smaller items inside. The bracelet went in first, wrapped in a handkerchief. Then the earrings, the brooch, a small tiara that could be worn as a necklace. She was so focused on her task that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching from the corridor. Her hands worked quickly, her breath coming faster as she realized how many pieces she could carry. Just a few more, she thought. Just these precious few that no one would miss right away. The inventory of the Queen's jewels was extensive. It might be weeks before anyone noticed these particular items were gone. She could wear them privately, she told herself, or perhaps have them reset into new designs that would be distinctly hers. Her fingers closed around one more box, a heavy one that promised something spectacular inside. Thomas McAllister had served the royal family for 32 years. He started as a young footman and worked his way up to become one of the senior guards, responsible for protecting the royal residences and their contents. He took his duty seriously, perhaps more seriously than most. That morning, he had arrived early for his shift, as he always did. Something felt wrong to him. The palace had a different energy since the Queen's passing, and he had learned to trust his instincts over the decades. He was making his rounds through the private quarters when he noticed that the door to the late Queen's chambers was slightly ajar. This was unusual. The room had been sealed after the Queen's passing, with strict orders that no one was to enter without explicit permission from the king himself. Thomas approached carefully, his training kicking in automatically. He could hear movement inside, the soft rustle of fabric, the quiet clink of something metallic. His pulse quickened as he realized someone was inside the room without authorization. Thomas had seen many things during his years of service. He had caught thieves attempting to scale the palace walls, tourists who had wandered into restricted areas, and even staff members taking items that didn't belong to them. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw when he pushed the door open wider. There stood Camilla, the Queen consort herself, leaning over the Queen's dresser with several jewelry boxes open before her and her handbag filled with treasures that belonged to the crown. For a moment, Thomas stood frozen in the doorway. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. The Queen consort, the wife of the king, was taking jewelry from the late Queen's private collection. He watched as her hands hovered over a diamond tiara, saw her glance toward the door nervously, and then witnessed her slip a pearl necklace into her bag. Thomas cleared his throat loudly, and Camilla spun around so fast that she nearly knocked over a jewelry box. Her face went pale, then flushed red as their eyes met. The silence that followed was deafening. Camilla's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Thomas stood his ground, his expression neutral but firm. He had been trained never to show emotion on duty, but inside, his mind was reeling. How should he handle this? She was the queen consort, second only to the king in the royal hierarchy. Yet she was clearly caught doing something that was not only improper, but potentially criminal. The crown jewels and the personal collection of the late queen were protected by law. No one, not even members of the royal family, could simply take them without proper procedure and documentation. Camilla's first instinct was to claim authority, to remind this guard of who she was, and demand that he leave immediately. She drew herself up to her full height, her chin lifting in that imperious way she had perfected over the years. But something in Thomas's steady gaze made her pause. He wasn't looking at her with the usual deference that palace staff showed to royals. He was looking at her the way he might look at any person caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. It was a look of disappointment mixed with professional detachment. She set down the jewelry box she had been holding and tried to smile. It came out wrong, more like a grimace. She began to explain that she was simply looking through the pieces, cataloging them perhaps, making sure everything was in order. The words sounded weak, even to her own ears. Thomas said nothing, just stood there waiting. His silence was more damning than any accusation could have been. Camilla felt her carefully constructed excuse crumbling. She glanced at her handbag, knowing that the pieces inside it betrayed her true intentions. Thomas finally spoke, his voice calm and respectful but firm. He said that he would need to report this incident to his supervisor and ultimately to the king. The protocol was clear. Any unauthorized access to the late queen's belongings, especially her jewelry collection, had to be documented and reported. There could be no exceptions, regardless of who was involved. Camilla felt panic rising in her chest. If this got out, if the king learned of this, the scandal would be enormous. The press would have a field day. All the years she had spent trying to win over the public, trying to prove herself worthy of her position, would be destroyed in an instant. She tried a different approach, her voice softer now, almost pleading. She explained that she had only wanted to see the pieces up close, to understand what would one day be in her care. She suggested that perhaps they could forget this misunderstanding. There was no need to trouble anyone with such a minor incident. She reminded Thomas of his years of loyal service, suggested that discretion was often the better part of valor. But Thomas remained unmoved. He had taken an oath to protect the crown and its property. That oath meant more to him than any personal consequences or the favor of powerful people. Camilla realized with growing horror that this guard was not going to look the other way. She had miscalculated badly. In her eagerness to possess these beautiful objects, she had forgotten that there were still people in the palace who served principles rather than personalities. Thomas gestured politely, but firmly toward the door, indicating that she should leave the room. Camilla hesitated, looking back at the jewelry spread across the dresser. With shaking hands, she opened her handbag and began removing the pieces she had taken, placing them back on the dresser one by one. Each item felt heavier than before, weighted with shame and fear. Within the hour, the incident had been reported up the chain of command. Thomas had followed protocol exactly, first informing his immediate supervisor, who then contacted the master of the household, who in turn requested an urgent meeting with the king. The news spread through the senior palace staff like wildfire. Though everyone involved understood the need for absolute discretion, this was a matter that could shake the monarchy to its foundations if it became public knowledge. The king was informed during his morning briefing, and those present reported that his face had turned ashen with shock and anger. The king summoned both, Camilla and Thomas, to his private study. The meeting was tense and painful. Camilla tried to maintain her composure, but her hands twisted in her lap as she attempted to explain herself. She spoke of feeling overwhelmed by her new role, of wanting to honor the late queen by wearing her jewelry, of not thinking clearly in her grief. But the king was not in a forgiving mood. He reminded her that these were not merely jewelry pieces but national treasures, part of Britain's heritage. Many of the items she had attempted to take were specifically designated to be worn only by the reigning monarch, or the Queen. Thomas stood at attention throughout the meeting, answering questions when asked but otherwise remaining silent. The king thanked him for his diligence and loyalty, making it clear that Thomas had done exactly what was required of him. Then came the difficult discussion of what to do next. The king knew that if this incident became public, it would be a disaster for the monarchy. The British people had loved his mother deeply, and the idea that his wife had tried to steal her jewelry would provoke outrage. Yet he also knew that covering it up completely would be wrong and potentially even more damaging if the truth ever emerged. A compromise was reached. There would be no police investigation, as technically, the king could handle the matter as an internal family issue. However, Camilla would face serious consequences. She was banned from entering the late Queen's chambers ever again. A complete inventory of all royal jewelry would be conducted immediately, and security protocols would be strengthened. Most significantly, Camilla would not be permitted to wear any of the late Queen's personal jewelry collection for at least 2 years. She could wear official crown jewels during state occasions, but only those pieces specifically approved by the king each time. It was a public humiliation disguised as a private arrangement. For Camilla, this was devastating. She had worked so hard to establish herself as queen consort. Now she would be restricted in ways that would be noticed by royal watchers and the press. People would ask why she never wore certain pieces, why her jewelry choices seemed limited. She left the king's study feeling defeated and ashamed. Thomas, meanwhile, was quietly transferred to a different section of the palace. It was described as a promotion, but everyone understood it was really about removing him from daily contact with Camilla. To avoid the awkwardness of the situation, the weeks following the incident were difficult for everyone involved. Camilla moved through her royal duties with a forced smile, but those close to her noticed the change. She seemed diminished somehow, less confident. During public appearances, royal observers noted that she wore less impressive jewelry than expected for someone in her position. Speculation began in the press about whether there was tension between the king and queen consort, but the truth remained hidden behind palace walls. The official explanation for Camilla's modest jewelry choices was that she was being respectful during the mourning period, which most people accepted. Thomas continued his duties in his new position, but the incident weighed on him. He had done the right thing. He was certain of that. Yet he also understood that he had fundamentally changed the dynamics within the royal family. He had caught the queen consort doing something shameful, and that knowledge would forever alter how she looked at him and how he fit into the palace hierarchy. Some of his colleagues treated him differently now, too. A few admired his integrity, but others thought he should have found a quieter way to handle the situation. The palace was a place where discretion was valued above almost everything else. The king himself struggled with the aftermath. He loved Camilla, had fought for years to be able to marry her, and now found himself deeply disappointed in her behavior. Their relationship became strained. During private moments, he would sometimes look at her and see, not his wife, but someone who had disrespected his mother's memory in the worst possible way. Camilla felt this distance between them and tried desperately to bridge it. She volunteered for more charitable work, made extra efforts to connect with the public, and never mentioned the jewelry incident. But the damage had been done. A special committee was formed to create new protocols for the royal jewelry collection. Every piece was photographed, cataloged, and assigned specific rules about who could wear it and under what circumstances. The late Queen's personal items were separated from the official crown collection and placed in a secured vault with multiple locks and constant surveillance. Access required written authorization from the king himself, and no one could enter the vault alone. These changes were presented to the public as routine modernization of security procedures. But inside the palace, everyone knew they were a direct result of what Camilla had done. As months passed, the immediate crisis faded but was not forgotten. Camilla learned to live with her restricted access to the jewelry that she had once coveted so desperately. She wore the pieces she was allowed with grace, never complaining publicly about the limitations placed upon her. But privately, Every time she saw photographs of the late queen wearing the magnificent jewels that were now forever out of her reach, she felt a sharp pang of regret. She had let her desire for beautiful things cloud her judgment. The price she paid was far higher than the value of any jewels. She had lost trust, respect, and a piece of her own dignity that could never be fully restored. Years passed, and the story of that morning became one of the palace's secret histories, known only to a select few. Thomas eventually retired with honors, his service recognized and celebrated, though the specific reason for his most important act was never made public. He kept the secret for the rest of his life, as did others who knew the truth. Camilla continued in her role as queen consort, gradually rebuilding her reputation through years of dedicated public service. The king eventually softened toward her, though their relationship never quite returned to what it had been before. The jewelry that Camilla had tried to take remained in the vault, rarely seen by anyone. Occasionally, pieces would be loaned for museum exhibitions, where millions of people could admire them, ironically, by trying to keep them for herself. Camilla had ensured that they would be more carefully guarded and less accessible than ever before. The late queen's collection became a symbol of continuity and tradition, a reminder that some things belonged not to individuals, but to history itself. Future generations would benefit from the stricter protections, even if they never knew why those protections had been put in place. For Camilla, the incident became a defining moment of personal growth. She learned that being part of the royal family meant being a custodian of tradition rather than an owner of treasures. She came to understand that the respect and affection of the British people could not be won through wearing the right jewelry or having the right title. It had to be earned through service, humility, and genuine care for others. She threw herself into charitable work, focusing particularly on causes that had been important to the late queen. Slowly, painfully, she began to make peace with what she had done and who she had been in that moment of weakness. Thomas, in his retirement, sometimes thought about that morning. He never regretted his decision to report what he had seen, but he wondered about the ripple effects of his action. Had he been too rigid? Could there have been a better way to handle it? But then he would remember his oath, his duty, and the trust that the royal family and the British people had placed in him. He had been a guard not just of physical treasures, but of principles and values. In the end, that was what mattered most. He had done his job with integrity, and he could look back on his career with pride. The king, reflecting on the incident in later years, saw it as a crucial test of the monarchy's values. By ensuring that his wife faced consequences for her actions, he had demonstrated that no one was above the rules, not even those closest to the crown. It was a painful lesson, but an important one. The monarchy's survival depended on maintaining the public's trust, and trust required accountability. The jewelry incident, though, kept secret. It reinforced within the palace walls the importance of duty, honor, and respect for tradition. These values would guide the institution for generations to come. In the end, the true treasure was not the diamonds or the emeralds or the historic tiaras. It was the integrity of people like Thomas who stood up for what was right even when it was difficult. It was the humility that Camilla eventually found after her moment of greed. And it was the strength of an institution that could face its own internal scandals and emerge stronger, wiser, and more committed to the principles it represented. The jewels remained in their vault, beautiful and untouched, waiting for future monarchs who would understand that wearing them was not a right but a privilege, and that with that privilege came tremendous responsibility.